This is the Anthrobiology Podcast, hosted by me, Gabby LaPera. Every 2 weeks, I interview a biological anthropologist about what makes us, us. Hey friends, it's Gabby LaPera. I'm here in San Francisco, as I have been for the last 7 weeks. Luckily, I have this episode from back in August of 2019, and I was in Washington, D.C., where I got to interview Dr. Billeck. We talked about repatriation, which is one of the probably most important topics in physical anthropology today. This is a really good episode. I know I say that about most of them, but the reason I think this one is so good is we do a really good job of giving context and explaining everything. In fact, we do such a good job that I'm going to let this intro be really short. The only thing I want to say before you get into it is that if you are a biological anthropologist or you know a biological anthropologist that wants to be on this show, feel free to shoot me an email at gabby.lapera@anthrobiology.com. All right, y'all, enjoy. Hello, everyone. This is Gabby LaPera. I'm here with Dr. Billeck at the Natural History Museum in the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. I'm in his office, and I'm very excited to talk to you today. Dr. Billeck, can you tell me a little bit about yourself and what you do here at the Smithsonian?
I am the head of the Repatriation program here at the National Museum of Natural History, and my job is to make sure that we go forward and respond to our requirements to do repatriation with Native American tribes throughout the country.
I think this is something that a lot of people outside of anthropology have no experience with. So in the Smithsonian's collection and a lot of museums' collections, there are quite a few Native American remains and objects, and a lot of those were acquired through perhaps less than ethical means. And there were a few pieces of legislation passed in the late 80s, early 90s that are helping return those items to the tribes that they originally belonged to. Can you talk to us a little bit about those two? They're called NAGPRA, which is the Native Americans Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, and the NMAIA, which is the Native American
National Museum of American Indian Act of 1989.
National.
So that's let's start with that one because it's the earlier one.
Okay.
And that's the law that is particularly for the Smithsonian, and it's only for the Smithsonian. And it required us initially to return human remains and funerary objects to Native American tribes that are culturally affiliated with them. And it put a burden on the museum to try to figure out where they came from in conjunction with Native American representatives. So we were not to do it alone. We would try to do it in consultation where possible. And we would use the best available historical and scientific information. So we were to do our best effort to try to figure this out. And when we were able to determine cultural affiliation, then we were to return those remains to the tribes if they desired to have them back.
I was reading that the Smithsonian has somewhere around 18,000 Native American remains when this process began. Do you know about how many they've returned now in 2019?
So through time, we have managed to culturally affiliate about 6,500 individuals of that initial amount, and we're still working on additional remains, and we do that in conjunction with the tribes. We try to do it when they're ready to move ahead. Of those, about 2/3 of those, the tribes have made decisions to have them repatriated, to go back. Some tribes have not made those decisions yet, and there's no deadlines on when the repatriation process is to be completed for tribes.
Okay, so that's actually a really interesting question to me. Are there tribes that choose not to have remains repatriated?
There are tribes that are not moving ahead with repatriation, and it's hard to know why. Could be that it's cultural reasons. It could be that it's inappropriate to bring them back. It could be it's cultural reasons because it's very hard to do that. Because where do you rebury individuals? How do you rebury them? Who takes responsibility to rebury them? These are all questions that the tribes and tribal representatives have to be able to figure out. And it can be expensive and time-consuming to make those decisions and to make them appropriately.
Absolutely. I think the other thing that really stood out to me from what you were saying earlier was that you have to use the best available methods to determine cultural affiliation. I guess it's a two-part question. What is cultural affiliation? I feel like that's something that you say and you're like, oh, I think it just means that it belongs to a certain tribe. But like, I feel like there must be a better definition. And then the other question is, how do you determine cultural affiliation?
Well, it's interesting. Neither law really, and we haven't talked about NACPRA yet, but neither law really defines cultural affiliation. It tells you how to figure it out. And the closest it gets to it says that there is a shared group identity between a modern day group and the individuals in the past. And that's a hard thing to figure out. And we're to use the preponderance of evidence, which means more likely than not that there's a relationship between a present group and a past group. So it's a pretty high standard in some ways because you have to know something about the human remains and objects, like who they could be from. And then how do you do that as you go back in time? And the evidence we can use is any evidence you can think of. We can use oral history, we can use historic accounts, we can use biological anthropology, we can use the styles of the artifacts themselves, we can use geography. We will use any evidence we can find to try to reach that preponderance.
I was reading that there are, at least in the biological anthropology front, y'all use everything from morphology, so looking at the shape and structure of the bones, and then relating it back to the statistical probability that it belongs to certain groups, but that can only get you so far, right?
That's true. And biology may not be the same thing as culture, so you can have a good deal of variation within a group. And then how do you know that one individual is a member of one group or another? And it's only a statistical relationship, and how relevant is that? So we have to be very careful with using only biology. So it's one part of the evidence, and especially when we're talking about the shape of somebody's bones.
Right.
But it can be a very important addition when we're very close to affiliation to make us decide between two groups that one is more likely than the other.
I know that using the shape of people's bones to make decisions about where they came from can be very touchy, because there is a history in biological anthropology of using the shape of someone's skull to make decisions about who they are morally. And I just want to be clear that that's not what's happening here when we talk about morphology.
No, that's not what's happening. It's just one of hopefully many lines of evidence that pushes us towards preponderance in one way or another.
Certainly. And I was also reading that as time goes on, you have more and more tools available to you. So, for example, DNA or mitochondrial DNA evidence could potentially be used in some cases. Isotopic analysis. And isotopic analysis is a really interesting thing. I'm just going to explain it real quick for listeners.
Please go ahead, because we have not done DNA or isotopic analysis yet.
Oh, okay. Yes. So isotopic analysis is a process where you take bone and you determine what concentration of certain elements are inside of it. And by doing that, you can kind of understand where the person was living when their bones were being formed. And this is really useful in cases where you know what kind of the map of your country looks like in terms of distribution of elements. Not so useful if you don't know. I know that they've used that in some other international cases, which is not under your purview, so we're not going to talk about that. You also use some of the items that might have been found with the individual, or you also use accession records. Do you want to explain what accession records are?
Well, before we get to that, let me just talk a little bit about why we don't do DNA. And isotopic analysis. And one of the reasons is because the tribes have not supported it, and it's semi-destructive. So you have to take some of the bone or some other material and subject it to destruction in order to extract that information. And many of the tribes are not willing to have that done. Some are. We would consider it in the repatriation process if a tribe supported it and we thought that it would resolve a cultural affiliation issue. If it's not going to resolve the issue, there's no reason to do it.
It's expensive too.
It's expensive, and we don't know if it will actually give us a result that we can interpret and will be meaningful.
Well, and another thing that I was reading was, I think in NAGPRA and in the NMAIA, it said that you could release the remains to either direct descendants or to federally recognized tribes. So people who fall outside of that would kind of be out of luck. But I suppose the only place that I could see DNA potentially being useful is if a direct descendant said, I think this is the bones of my grandfather, for example. Can you test them to see if they belong?
There could be a few situations we may be able to potentially DNA could tell us which tribe an individual came from. But you're correct that it would be very useful for if we had somebody who says, I think I'm a lineal descendant of that individual, and right now we can't prove it.
Mm-hmm.
But with DNA, it would make it much more likely that you could show that there was a descent relationship. Because in the repatriation process, lineal descendants have the highest standing. So if we can identify a lineal descendant, they have the first right to make decisions about what happens to the remains of their ancestor. If we don't have lineal descendants and we can determine what tribe the remains came from, they have first standing.
Have you had cases where you have had lineal descendants?
Yes, we've had a number of them, and sometimes we've been able to identify lineal descendants, and sometimes that can be very difficult because we may have a partial name or we may have a full name, and then we work with trying to find lineal descendants, and sometimes we work with the tribe itself to try to help us to find those lineal descendants. Sometimes we can't find them, or they're not known, or the name is maybe not a real name, that somebody sent a name in with the remains that may not be correct. But in a number of cases, we've returned to the descendants. And one example is we had a lock of hair from Sitting Bull that was obtained from him by an army surgeon after he had been killed. And that surgeon didn't have the right to take that lock of hair. And we were, after some long discussions with the tribe and trying to locate lineal descendants, we were successful in locating 4 of his closest living great-grandchildren.
Wow. And did they take the hair?
They took that. Yes, they did.
That's incredibly impressive. And I think that also gives insight into how much work must have been done to repatriate the 6,500 individuals that you've done so far.
Yes, we consider every individual separately, and one individual can take quite a while to figure out cultural affiliation. But sometimes they're groups of individuals because they're from one location, and you can assess their affiliation all at one time. So it's not 6,500 separate ones, but each individual was given time, care, due diligence to try to figure it out.
Yeah, certainly. I do want to talk about accession records, and those are basically the records that come in with the individuals, right? So whatever documentation you have from when they came into the museum and like what happened once they came into the museum. But the Smithsonian's kind of an older institution, and so you have all these accession records from the 1800s, which may or may not be reliable, but it's something that you do use during your process, correct?
Oh, yes. So we'll try to find all the original records that came in with the remains and objects, and to learn as much as we can. And sometimes the records are really detailed, and sometimes, for some reason, there are no records. So we have the accession records, which is when a collection comes in, it's put under an accession number. And then all the records that came in with that collection are to be in that location. And you can go look it up and read what should be in there. But we're an old museum, and individuals corresponded with a number of people at the Smithsonian. So the records may have not ended up in the accession record. It may be in the papers of somebody who worked here. So you have to look elsewhere. And that can be very time-consuming, trying to find those hidden pieces of information that are in different places at the museum, because we're about 175 years old, and that's a long history of record-keeping and changes in record-keeping and changes in museum methodology. But after things are accessioned, the collection is divided into different categories, and individual items or groups of items that are very similar are given catalog numbers. And a catalog who will then be given a description of what it is and where it's from, and that's very useful information also to look at. So we're detectives looking in the museum records for information about the history of the collection, and most of the relevant information about collections are the primary information is on a catalog card, but to find more information you have to go do that search through the accession records and any other records we can find.
That sounds daunting and really exciting when you manage to figure something out.
There's a lot of information and a lot of important collections that when you go back to the original records, they didn't record it completely, and you can learn a lot more about what's present in the collection and how important it is and where the collection is from.
Do you have any stories that you'd like to share? Some successes, some problems that you potentially had? Any stories that are symbolic of your time here in the Repatriation Office?
I'll tell one that has been written about a little bit, and it's about an individual who was identified in the records when the remains first came here as Kiowa. And
where are the Kiowa?
The Kiowa are a tribe in the plains, in the southern plains. And the remains were sent from a military post called Fort Sully in South Dakota, which is on the Missouri River in basically central South Dakota. And that's about all we knew. And
do you know when they were sent?
They were sent in probably the 1870s.
And I think this is something that listeners should know, which is that when the Smithsonian first started out, they basically told the military if they found interesting stuff to just ship it back, which is why you have a lot of stuff that ended up at the museum in like the early 1800s before anyone really realized this was unethical. It's a very different time. It's not an excuse, but I'm just giving insight into the historical context.
But let me talk about that because it's a little more complicated
Please
than
do.
that. So there's bad parts of these stories. In the early 18th century, individuals were interested in the cranial shapes of people and intelligence and looking at the size of people's brains and shapes of people's faces, and thought that this might tell you something about the character and intelligence of different groups. That's since been completely discredited, but that was an interest at the time. And an army surgeon who worked at the Army Medical Museum was interested in these issues, and he requested from the Surgeon General if they could request from Army soldiers to send in remains to the Army Medical Museum. And they sent out a flyer that requested those human remains. And the Smithsonian had about 300 skeletal remains from around the world. And we came to an agreement with the Army Medical Museum in the 1860s that we had no reason to keep the skeletal remains, so we transferred our skeletal remains to them, and any objects they transferred to us. So until 1898, we had no human remains at the Smithsonian. In 1898, the Army Medical Museum transferred what they considered the remains that they had to the Smithsonian. And that's how we got Army collections here. And most of the Army collections are from remains that are from cemeteries, some from military encounters from the 19th century, generally 1860s, 1870s, 1880s.
And I'm assuming that record keeping and identifying cultural affiliation was perhaps not first and foremost on the soldiers' minds when they were sending back skeletal remains.
It's really actually pretty good.
Interesting.
Because when the Surgeon General asked for human remains, he wanted to know what tribe they came from. So they would provide the tribe if they knew it. And so probably 90% of the remains the Army soldiers sent in had tribal affiliation. And when we see that, we consider that a very strong attribution. It doesn't mean we always agree with it, because sometimes there's we look at does this fit everything else we know about this individual and how they were treated in death and where they lived, and sometimes there's surprising results when you start looking at the evidence and how did the soldier know that. We often don't know that, but sometimes there's some things that we're surprised at.
So that brings us back to the story of the Kiowa.
The Kiowa individual.
Kiowa.
And it ends up that the soldier who sent in these remains, when we went back and found the original letter, did not have the word Kiowa in it. So he never identified the person as Kiowa. He had written the word known in script, and if you write the word known out and you're looking for a tribal identification, you could easily mistake it for Kiowa. So he had never said Kiowa, and this was a case where all the museum records said that the individual was Kiowa through time, but the original record did not. And we didn't have a tribal affiliation, but we knew the person had been sent from central South Dakota. We knew the person had been buried in the ground. And this is a case where we had geography and burial practices we knew. We knew which tribes would be in that area at about that time. And so then we looked at the morphology of the person's face, and we were able to determine that this person was most likely another Plains tribe called the Arikara, who now live in North Dakota. So then we ended up, that was the affiliation we put forward.
That's amazing. And did the individual end up with the Arikara?
The individual was made available for the Arikara. The Arikara have not made a decision on what to do yet.
Fair. I think the other thing that I would really like to talk to you about, something that you've touched on a few times, is that you do everything kind of in consultation with the tribes. How is that relationship? How does that work? Is it contentious? Is it friendly? Can you just give a little insight into that?
It's generally friendly. We're trying to solicit information as much as we can about particular cultural affiliation identifications. How do we make this assessment? Does the tribe have any additional information that can help us? We write a report that talks about what evidence we have found. If it's human remains and funerary objects, what objects are in it, what remains, where they're from, how they were acquired, what information we have been able to assemble. And we send that to the tribe and ask them if they have anything additional that they can provide to us to help us figure out the final result. In some cases, it's pretty obvious what the cultural affiliation will be. In other cases, it's much more difficult.
I think the other thing that I read about that I found very interesting was that sometimes the tribes make requests for how you handle the remains, and when possible, you all seem to go out of your way to do that. I read, for example, making sure that the skulls of certain tribe members face east, or that ritual smudging be done in certain cases, or that they be able to feed the bodies. Have you had any experience with that?
We've had experience with all of those, where it could be orientation of the remains. We've had cases where people have asked the remains to be covered with a certain type of cloth. This is while they're here, and we've had people do smudging with the remains, and they've left offerings temporarily, some food or other things with the remains. But that's
difficult in a museum setting.
Yes, because leaving food in the collections can attract insects, and insects can be very destructive to collections. So that some of those things we can do have to be temporary and have to be under very controlled circumstances.
When you're an anthropologist, you spend a lot of time thinking about the relationship between Native Americans and anthropologists. I think when you're a regular person, it's not really a topic that you think of. And I think that it's very heartening to hear kind of what a productive relationship you seem to have had.
I think repatriation has reopened and strengthened relationships between museums, anthropologists, and Native Americans, because one, repatriation was resolving a very difficult problem that there was between Native people and anthropologists, is that all these skeletal remains had been taken from them, almost invariably without any permission from the tribes, and sometimes, clearly related to the tribes, and sometimes more distantly related to the tribes. And so you can see there are people who are grave robbers, and I understand how some tribes can look at anthropologists as doing something very similar, where the anthropologists are saying, I'm doing this for science and to learn more about, the history of this tribe. But that was appropriate to do 50, 100 years ago, at least the standards of the field, and today it would not be at all.
And I think that that's part of the reason that you see NAGPRA and NMAIA passed when they do, is because that's kind of the culmination of a lot of things changing in American society and a greater understanding of the rights of other groups besides the groups in power. I do have one last question for you. Okay. Well, I have actually a few more questions for you, but the rest are easy after this one. What happens when you can't find a cultural affiliation for an individual? So what if it's a prehistoric remain, or what if it's just you just can't?
When we can't at the Smithsonian, we list them as culturally unaffiliated at the time, and we consider that hopefully a temporary place to be, and they're retained by the museum until we can figure out what the affiliation could be. So we hope that new techniques, new evidence will come forward in the future, and we'll be able to figure this out.
And are tribes okay with that, or it kind of varies from tribe to tribe, I assume?
I think some people are not satisfied with that. Some tribes want to restrict repatriation to remains that are from their tribe and not have the possibility that they're repatriating remains from a different tribe. But other tribes think it's a human rights issue, that all the remains should be returned to somebody.
Sticky. It's a sticky situation. Okay, so I always ask, is there anything else you would like to say? Would you like to give words of wisdom for people coming into anthropology? Do you want to talk about your favorite soup recipe? Literally anything you want to say.
I think repatriation has really helped museums establish a better relationship with tribes. There were relationships between individuals in the past at museums and anthropologists and tribes, and I think that had fallen away in many cases because of repatriation, the lack of resolution to repatriation issues. And that's changed. The other thing that's greatly changed is repatriation has opened doors, not just for repatriation purposes, to what's in collections that tribes didn't know, tribal representatives didn't know what was in museums, because it's hard to tell. And with the digital age and more information becoming available, the collections are out there, and tribes can come and see them. They can see them digitally. They can come to visit the museums. Like, we have grants that allow tribal representatives to come to the museum to consult on the collections, to see what's here. So there's all sorts of new relationships that have developed out of this. And there's a great more knowledge among Native people about what's in museums, and that's important.
That's wonderful. Okay, last 3 questions of the interview. These are easy questions, I promise. Well, the last 2 are definitely easy. My first one is, if someone wants to read more about this, is there an article or a book that would be really good for them to take a look at?
It's very hard to pick one book.
You can give more than one.
And it's not something. This is actually a very hard question because I don't read that literature.
Right. I feel like you probably wouldn't read introductions to repatriation literature.
No, and so we're focused on doing, what's the next assessment to do, and how do we do that? I'll have to think about that answer.
Okay. Well, in the meantime, I will point people towards this weighty tome of an article that I read in preparation for this interview. It's called Repatriation Legislation in Physical Anthropology. Don't let the name scare you. It was wonderful. Here are 2 easier questions. Is there anything you're reading for work right now?
What I'm reading for work right now is the history of the Cree tribe in Canada and the U.S., because we have a repatriation case I'm working on to try to understand the history of how a Cree individual ended up in Montana.
That sounds super interesting. Is there any particular book or article associated with that you'd like to recommend, or just generally that's what you're reading?
That's generally what I'm reading.
Are you reading anything for fun right now?
I'm reading for fun. I'm not sure this is fun. We have a new puppy.
Oh, congratulations!
So I'm reading a book on how to train dogs.
What kind of puppy do you have?
A collie puppy.
Oh, so my parents just got a border collie. She's 7 months old, She's nuts and so wonderful. And I have a little Chihuahua Dachshund mix who is the apple of my eye. And she's just spent this entire time being herded around by my parents' border collie.
That's what they do.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Anthrobiology Podcast. If you have questions or comments, you can reach me at gabby.lapera@anthrobiology.com. That's spelled GABY.LAPERA@anthrobiology.com. This show was produced and edited by me. Music courtesy of Chad Crouch, aka Poddington Bear at Sound of Picture.